me out, you can wear someone else out. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. Basically, I will give you a little bit of background. So he basically did his undergrad at St. Petersburg, master's at St. Petersburg, worked in Siberia for 9 years, which he described as being some of the best years of his life. I worked in Northern Alberta for not that long. Well, okay, 4 months. It's almost compared to 9 years. But he's done some great stuff. He then moved to the US to work at Ohio State. And then he basically moved on to a variety of places, but he's been devoted to this system for a long time. So I think you're going to enjoy kind of a diversity of topics that he's going to cover on food caching, cognitions, and the environment. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. My talk may be somewhat a little bit different. So I'm I started as a field ecologist and behavioral ecologist long time ago. And in my previous life, right? So I started working with Chickadee system. My first paper I published, I believe, in '89. So I'm kind of pretty old with this. And then I don't think. Okay, and my whole career has been shaped kind of by trying to understand how small animals like chickadees can survive, right? So you will see throughout my talks, it eventually went to cognition, and so I've done a lot of different things in there as well. And so similar to the previous speaker, somebody considered me scattered, and I've heard multiple times saying, jack of all trades and master of none. So I've done neuroscience, I've done hormones and endocrinology, and I'm pretty interested in cognition, of course, and now I move the whole thing into the wild. So where my most work now is focused on measuring cognition directly into the wild, right? And I'll argue why that may be important than just staying in a lab and trying to understand them. But anyway, like I said, when I was still an undergraduate student and I wanted to study something glorious like eagles or something, I remember that one of my advisors said, like, well, what would you do with eagles? Like, what would you study with eagles? And I said, well, they're beautiful, they're amazing. And they said, okay, well, go look at it. And so I spent a year at White Sea, close to Finland, and I came back, and he said, what did you find? And I said, well, I spent countless hours watching them, and that's it, right? And he said, well, did you see these little birds flying around? I'm like, yeah, and what are they? Like, well, there's the chickadees, and you may notice that they do this little weird thing when they stash their food. And those words were prophetic words, as I call them, because they shaped my entire career since that time, right? And so, and again, growing up in northern Russia and then working in Siberia and doing my master's in close to northern Finland, you cannot not be struck by the amazing ability and resilience of the small birds like chickadees. As you can see here, there's a mountain chickadee, but we have willow tits and Siberian tits in Eurasia. When they can survive, they don't migrate, they're non-migratory birds, so they can stay in the same areas in the winter, throughout the winter. They're 12-gram birds, and if you go work in northern Finland, in Lapland or Siberia, you have 2 hours of light, 22 hours of dark, and minus 40 degrees, right? How can such a small thing do well, right? And so that kind of started again, so that kind of was the initial impetus of kind of studying this, right? So, and then I discovered this food caching thing, right? So, and that's where I'll talk a little bit more about this. So what is food caching? So it's well known across multiple species, but in birds probably more documented. You've all probably heard about nutcrackers, and nutcrackers are champions of food caching. And I've been arguing half of my life that actually chickadees cache way more than nutcrackers, but they never get credit that they deserve, right? But nutcrackers get all the glory. But anyway, you can see the scrub jays, right? So we have nutcrackers. Some of you not know that's actually Eurasian nutcracker that caches also as much food as Clark's nutcracker, the jays, chickadees, and nuthatches. So to just impress upon you, you may say, okay, so they cache few little things, right? So again, part of my master's work was there. I was just trying to see and document how much can they cache, right? So and that work was done in early 80s when I just counted. So I followed these birds day in, day out throughout the entire year. They all were individually banded, and I was trying to see how much can they cache. And so you can see those numbers, right? So that even though the rough estimates suggest that an individual bird can cache close to 500,000 individual food items in a year. So just think about it, 500,000. Right? That's a big number for a 12-gram bird, right? So the question then is, oops, why is it not going now? No, it doesn't want to move. Okay. The question is how can they get those caches, right? Because if you cache 500,000 things, so if you can't get them back, they're useless. So you can't really do anything about them, right? And so that led to the whole study that started by David Sherry, who is now at Western, and John Krebs, by bringing memory into the realm, right? So now we know really well, and I'm not going to talk about the basic concepts of this, but we know really well that most food caching species use spatial memory to find their caches, right? Of course, whether they can find 500,000 items, that's still a big question, right? But that's the cognition aspect that, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this. And my main interest as an evolutionary biologist, again, I view myself more as a cognitive ecologist, behavioral ecologist / evolutionary biologist, and then I do neuroscience more like in the blend, trying to understand the mechanism. So in a way, the question I'm asking, not just what they can do, but why there are differences and how they evolved to be the way they are. What are the mechanisms that may have led to diversification, and why chickadees may have better spatial memory than humans or bees? I don't know, bees are a very big commodity and they're amazing, but I would argue chickadees have a much, much better memory even than bees or anything else. And I actually think better than nutcrackers, right? But anyway, so the question we can ask for us again, that if they store this food, do they find it, right? And if they find it, is it their own, right? And also, and it's a little bit more on the side, because a lot of Corvid work has been prominent by saying, oh, they know so much, right? They understand who finds them, who steals their caches. So chickadees also living in social groups, they live in mixed flocks. And so before I go into the in-depth memory, right, so a question that I ask, do they understand who can steal their stuff and who cannot, right? So if they live in mixed flocks and somebody can see them stashing their food, they can go and find it, right? And that's not good, right? So then you can expect to see animals that understand that concept, that they would try to prevent that from happening. And so in our case, now system here, where I studied them in Sierra Nevada now for quite a number of years, so we have this mountain chickadees, we have this red-breasted nuthatches, and juncos that all coexist in the same area. So nuthatches are also food caching species. So they can pilfer, they can steal as well as they can cache. So juncos cannot do that. So the question is, do they know who's seeing that? And the answer is, yes, they do. Right, so again, you would expect from pure evolutionary biology perspective that there should be selection pressure on them, right, to evolve some abilities to recognize who may find them, right, and so that you would expect that they should ignore species that present no risk to their caches, and you would expect them to really recognize when they're being watched by somebody who can steal their caches, right, and so. Simple experiment that one can do, right? So you can have here, you can have the caching substrates, and you can see they're arranged in line between two observers. When you have cage one, potential pilfer, which could be the same species or a different species, or you can have a non-pilfer on the other side. And if a chickadee pays attention, right, it should try to hide cache seeds away from where it can be seen, right? So for example, you would expect them never to cache on side one, but potentially cache on side two, because side two is on the other side, right? So the observer cannot see what they do. And so that's kind of the view of this chickadee, right? So you can see this. So when it sits there, the observer, you cannot even see it behind that main trunk, right? So chickadee does not see them as well. And so you can see that there is also basically, I mean, not surprisingly, they do pay attention, right? So you can see you have a potential pilfer. In this case, it's a chickadee. They avoid caching on a substrate that's in plain view of an observer who's a potential thief, and then they ignore completely the species that cannot steal this from them, right? So when we put a nuthatch, again, it's a different species. They respond the same way. And so in this experiment, we also control for side effects by between trial moving left to right, so that we are trying to make sure that they're not just trying to cache on one side of the room. So they're definitely responding to who is there, who is watching them. And if you have no observers, they're utilizing all surfaces evenly, right? So again, pretty clear thing. I know it's kind of following up a little bit on a previous thing, right? So previous comments of previous speaker about what you think about this and what scientists may want, right? So I remember when I showed this, right? So I tried to publish an article in Science, and I said, chickadees know who's watching them. And one reviewer basically said, well, you don't know what they know. All you can say is they discriminate, right? So okay, so here it is. They discriminate. But the bottom line is they know who discriminate against, right? And so they pay attention in that way. And it's important for the fitness in this case, right? Because we are talking about the behavior that has very clear fitness consequences. So if they lose their caches, or if they don't know how to find them, they most likely will not survive, right? So, right, I'm just gonna go, yeah. So in that way, it's actually interesting because they show very parallel behavior to corvids. However, corvids have been now consistently, touted in press, saying is they're being very special. So I'll mention it a little bit here. It's not the goal of my talk, but basically my argument that I've been arguing for a while is that the behaviors related to food caching are very similar. So most of the work on corvids has been done on scrub jays and other food caching corvids. And so those behaviors are not because of their social structure. There's no evidence for that. Those behaviors are directly in response to selection pressures related to food caching. And if that's the case, we would expect actually to see a lot of other animals, other species that do similar behaviors to act similarly. And so at least in my work, we're not trying to replicate everything, but everything we try to replicate, chickadees do exactly the same as corvids, right? So in this particular experiment. But anyway, back here to kind of the main thrust, and we've done a lot of different things with cognition, but I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about my main question that I've been pursuing and I'm still doing, and I'm still working on it, trying to understand why, how does it evolve? So why some birds have better memory, right? In this case, we're talking about spatial memory, and spatial memory is different from other object-oriented memory, right? So they're using spatial cues to learn locations of things. So we all know what it is, right? We use it as well. You may also know that even among humans, we have a lot of individual variation, how good people are at spatially or navigating in the area. So I know firsthand myself because we work in the field in the mountains. So for example, we have 400 nest boxes scattered over the mountains, and we work in the wilderness. There are no roads or anything. So I remember every single one of them. I can find them with my eyes closed, and I go and I point saying, here, you will see this tree on the side, right? And some students are good at it, and some students take forever to learn this location. That's spatial memory. There's nothing else to it, right? But we're different. We all are different. And so are the animals, right? So the question is, can that variation then be used by selection to generate phenotypes or to have a directed selection to produce better memory? So the concept or the background of my work, of my lab, right, is basically the simple things, right? So we assume, or at least we're testing the idea that differences in spatial memory among species and within species are a product of natural selection and not simple phenotypic plasticity or variation based on development. And so we assume that food caching is directly related to fitness. So the more caches means higher fitness, especially in areas where caches are important and there's no other food. Cache retrieval is directly connected to spatial memory. If you don't have good spatial memory, you're not going to be good at recovering your food caches. And then spatial memory is dependent directly on the hippocampus. That's a brain structure that's well known to be involved in spatial memory across multiple taxa, definitely in mammals and in birds. And so then we could expect that harsh environment should cause more reliance on cached food, right? When I mean harsh environment, living in Alaska versus living somewhere in Seattle is a big difference for these birds. Remember, they're non-migratory, right? So on the harsh environment with more snow, longer winter, food caches may be more important. Simply, if you don't get enough of them or you don't find them, you will die. And we're talking about most of these birds that they have very short life cycle. So in other words, let's say now a population of chickadees will have 50% turnaround every year of animals. So it's not Drosophila quite, but we expect that selection has a potential to act quickly on these things, right? If individuals with inferior memory abilities would simply die off much faster, right? So in these cases. So the concept also here is but pointing more towards finding difference within species based on population differences, right? So initial work on food caching that's in every textbook in animal behavior, comparing multiple species, or classical work by Campbell and Balda, looking at different jay species. But that work, despite when it's in textbook of animal behavior presented as crystal clear, it's actually not. So there's a lot of conflicting data in this. And so you've all heard that nutcrackers are better at spatial memory than scrub jays, but actually some other work showed that it's not always the case. Sometimes scrub jays show better, sometimes not, right? And in other words, there's more confusing, and there's a lot of criticism of this work at some point. And from my perspective, the thinking was going that when we're trying to test different species in a similar paradigm, we're kind of bringing very different species into the same thing, but they are different. They're different in many other ways, right? They're different in lots of other natural history aspects. And so we may be missing something because we're trying to only line up food caching, but we're missing everything else. We're missing social structure, territory size, all these other components, right? And so I always thought that if we can actually limit it to one species that has a very big range, we can look at kind of like natural experiments, if you will, right? So maybe not quite as much, but like Darwin looked at Darwin finches, right? So he didn't have a lot of replications. There was just a few islands, and yet he was able to demonstrate a pretty strong, provide strong evidence of selection, right? So anyway, if we bring this harsh environment idea, and again, harsh environment in a way of food caching is just that, right? So if you have longer winters, a longer period of time when food is not available, well, then caches become more important because that's all they have to eat. And they can't just go. They don't go anywhere. They either die or they survive. They don't migrate, right, all these birds. And so the work that we've done in two species. First, we work on black-capped chickadees, so that's one of the species we'll probably know because they're everywhere in Canada, and they occupy very large range, as you can see here, right? So you can see this range. And so you can see that some of area within that range are much milder. So if you go south in the US, south of the range in Kansas and in Colorado, especially in Colorado, they don't live at high elevations. They live actually on the flat areas. The winters are much milder. They're much shorter. Well, if you go to Alaska, the winter lasts much longer, snow cover much longer, right? And so it's a comparative approach, right? Not experimental approach. So we brought these birds to captivity from all these areas. You can see they're lined up based on their climate severity. And we looked at the hippocampal volume and then total number of neurons within the hippocampus. And as you can see, there's a pretty good association between where we sample the birds and how different the neural structures are, right? So again, in this case, we're trying to look just at neural substrate. And it's important because, as I'll talk a little bit more, when we're measuring cognitive performance, it's much more variable. It's higher variable than the mechanism. And so I've always kind of used this, right? So in other words, when you bring a bird or a rat into the lab and you test it, if you have done it, you will see there's going to be variance. So the birds definitely there's a lot of variance, right? Which is sometimes harder to explain. Partially, I think, actually, it's the captivity effects. But anyway, when you measure the mechanism, you're much more unbiased in the way, right? Because mechanisms are there or not. To count neurons, they're there or not, you count them, right? It doesn't depend on when the bird was in the mood or it didn't feel like doing this morning performance. And that's a substrate. The connection between the hippocampus and memory has been very well established. There's no doubt that hippocampus is involved in spatial memory. So the question then became, as we start sampling the environment from south to north, whether climate itself is important, like winter climate, and I like winter. I mean, I'm from Russia. I guess that's a cliche, right? So we have to like winter. So I grew up in snow, which is true, and I still love snow. And I'm probably the only one in Reno that loves snow. And I always like when it lasts longer, and everybody complains about it. But the key thing is, right, because what we have a confounding variable in this is the day length, right? So as you go from south to north, the day gets shorter and shorter. Well, what that means they have less time to eat, right? That's important as well. So one can argue that regardless of the climate itself, simply time constraint can lead to the same pressures. And so we wanted to test this. And again, the beauty of this is that we can actually look at it across the same time zone, because within the U.S. you can look at birds from Maine and Minnesota and then Seattle. And Seattle is an enclave. So when glaciers came over the Great Basin, right, they separated this area. So this is a separate population, but it's very mild. Climate's very mild. So if you've been to Seattle or Vancouver, so that's not winter there. I wouldn't call it winter, right? So, as you can see, the difference is still there, right? So birds that we've sampled from Maine and from Minnesota, they have much larger hippocampi and many more neurons in their brains on the hippocampus compared to birds from Seattle, and then we use a control from Iowa, right? And we controlled Alaska. So in a way, birds from Minnesota are much more similar to those in Alaska. But that makes sense because actually winters in Minnesota are very harsh, and if you look at just climatic data, then actually Minnesota is some of the coldest areas within the continental United States, right? So again, by doing this, we kind of showed that day length may be important, but it's not just important by itself. So clearly just winter conditions are more important, right? So here's another thing we compared this 10 populations. That hippocampal soma you can see on a photograph. So those are Alaska chickadees, and below, I believe those are the Colorado, Kansas chickadees. So you can see that neurons are much bigger in the brain, right? And you can say, what does it mean? So what is Soma? So Soma is a machinery, right? Soma is the power plant of the neuron, and that's what provides energy to all the connections. And so that feeds very well into the idea that they have more neurons, they have more neural connections that serves better spatial memory. So once we look at this large scale, the question that at least I had, and at that time, I started my work at UNR, University of Nevada, Reno, and we have Sierras right there, and we've already done some work on Chickadees there. But looking at elevations, which I didn't think initially before, basically, when you look at the mountain, you see the same thing changing on much shorter spatial scale. In other words, when you go to low elevations, the winter is much shorter, it's much milder. The higher you go in the mountains, the more snow you get, right? That's why all the skiers going all the way to the higher elevations, right? And so we were positioned very beautifully, strategically. It's only 30 minutes from my house or from my workplace, where I can go all these different elevations to 2,500 meters at high elevation. And actually our main locations, the field sites, are from just high and mid, but we also sampled low elevation. So just to show you the difference in snow level, you can see this is sampling among multiple years. We have a lot of variation in snow. There's high elevation on the right and low elevation on the left. So you probably would notice here that a year ago we had 5 meters of snow at high elevation. That's snow cover, 5 meters. So that's half of this building, right? So I was driving snowmobile in mid-June. My Facebook just threw a picture at me saying, that's what you were doing last year on this date. And there was about 2 feet of snow still at high elevations, right? But anyway, as you can see, there's a very drastic difference in how much snow and how long it stays. Which is also interesting that in the mountains and in the Sierra Mountains, the difference is not gradual. So the differences changes rather drastically once you hit a particular critical elevation. So it goes mile by mile and boom. And again, there's lots of pictures you can see when the first snow hits, you can see this white line. So if you drive anywhere where you can see it, probably somewhere if you are in Alberta, on the Rockies, or we definitely see it in Sierras, the first snow comes and like somebody drew the line, saying above the line you get snow, below the line you have rain. Right, and so that's very interesting because again, by simple coincidence, we were located, so we had field sites right above this, quite above this, and quite below this, right? So looking at both of these elevations. And so first, we brought these birds in the lab, and we tested their memory. You can see there's different tests we're doing. So I'll show some of this number. So usually the smaller number is better performance. So the way we test memory in the lab, at least in the Chickadees, so we bring them in the lab, we have all these different caching locations. In the beginning, we were using actually cache recovery test, but we moved away from that. And the reason that we moved away from that is because birds can actually bias their recovery by caching in a particular location that would make it easier for them to recover. And also different individuals can be different in that. So we moved to basically using associative learning tasks where we provide them food, right? And this way we control where the food is, and that provides better data across different birds because they cannot choose where it is. So they go in their room, they find food, we kick them out of the room, then sometime later we let them back into the room and see how well they can find where they found food before, right? So the best memory would be when they make no errors. Like one error, it means they found just opened one location and went to the correct location, right? So one thing we noticed that high elevation birds cache more food, which is also kind of anecdotal because when we brought it in, most of my colleagues didn't believe that we'll find anything. So there's a lot of debates about this. And so we put these birds in cages and we had high elevation, low elevation, high elevation, low elevation, high elevation, low elevation birds. And like most faculty, of course, we use a lot of undergrads to help us with this. And one undergrad came to me and said, I see this really strange thing that every other cage has a lot of sunflower seeds and pine nuts thrown out of the cage, but every other cage has nothing, right? And so I was like, that's interesting. That was every high elevation cage. So these birds in the cage, they're so hardwired to cache. For them to cache, they'll throw seeds out of the cage that they think is caching. We actually see this. We can document it. They're so motivated to store food that if you don't give them substrates, they will start trying to cache them everywhere within the cages. And so you go there's a pile of seeds, clean, pile of seeds, clean, right? I was like, we're on the right track, right? That immediately gave me a lot of confidence. And we've shown in control tests that they cache more food, right? Which is interesting because I was just arguing that caching is more important. And indeed, they actually cache more food, right? And they recovered better. We've also looked for a long-term retention where we train the bird in associative test. And you can see that mid-elevation birds were worse before they acquired the task. It took them 4 trials to basically match the high elevation birds. But once we lapsed about 2 weeks, then you can see that high elevation birds stayed flat. They were as good as they were before, while mid elevation birds actually forgot more. Right? So I always have questions saying, how come they have bad memory? And it's a little confusing. We're not talking about bad memory. They're still doing great. It's just we see these differences. None of them, I mean, it's not like they have, I mean, all of them are doing exceedingly well on spatial memory test. But nonetheless, we see very significant differences, both in retention and in memory acquisition, right? Again, in line with what we expect of a very short spatial scale. So when we look at the hippocampal volume or the number of neurons, again, you can see the same patterns, right? What's interesting, you can see this is a low and mid, there's not much difference. The snow line is here, right? So you can see drastic shift right above the snow line when they're changing. We've counted neuron numbers, we look at Soma size, we also look at neurogenesis, and they also have more neurogenesis. Yes?
The anti-caching cognitive adaptations, are they also indexed by elevation?
No, we have not looked at it. We don't know. So I can talk more, but yeah, because I just showed it as an interesting cognitive kind of things feeding in there, but we don't know if they are, because all these species coexist across. So all the work that we're doing now may look at it more, because now we're working with social networks. We're trying to understand the effect of social groups, social learning, and stealing as a result, and difference in individual cognition, how that may affect who they choose to socialize with and not, right? So that's kind of the future work that we're doing. But the point is, again, here, we're talking about 10-kilometer differences on flat space. And we see the same magnitude difference as we see difference between Kansas and Alaska, right? So, of course, the question, so basically they cache more food, they definitely have better memory accuracy, they have better memory retention, they have larger hippocampus, they have very high neurogenesis. I'll touch more on this because I think the idea of neurogenesis, at least within the behavioral ecology world, has been wrong. And I've published a lot of wrong ideas about this as well, because when neurogenesis initially was brought into there, the idea was that it actually helps memory, right? So in other words, adult neurogenesis, new neurons are coming into the hippocampus, they make birds remember better, or humans, or any animals, right? There's a lot of debate on this. Well, apparently, the work that's been very nice, and I like it, and fits much better actually in ecology, suggests what neurogenesis does, it actually causes forgetting. New neurons replace old neurons. When you lose old neurons, your old memories are gone, right? But by forgetting, you can actually be better at learning new information, which is interesting. I'll come back to this kind of idea, right? So it's interesting. But anyway, within Mount Chickadees, for example, at high elevation, 30 to 40% of all the neurons in the hippocampus are about 2 months old, which means they have extremely high rate of hippocampal neurogenesis. So the question, again, we've been asking, what's nature? How come we have these differences, right? And we're not talking about different species, so it's becoming more, from a purely subjective standpoint, more questionable, right? Because people are saying, well, how do you know it's not development? How do you know it's not epigenetics? How do we know it's not something else that they just, different environment, right? In other words, we need to really show that we're dealing with adaptation, and adaptation implies, of course, selection, because you can't have adaptation without selection, right? So one work, at least, that we did before, we did a common garden experiment, right? Because so if birds live, let's say, in Alaska, they cache more food, one can say, okay, they just develop better memory by doing more stuff, right? So we need to rule it out. So we brought these birds, we reared them from the same age, they're blind, we picked them all, and it's a pretty hard job. You have to feed them every 15 minutes from sunrise to sunset. They have to put them on a plane, then you have to fly them on late night, then you have to feed them the first thing you have to get off the plane. But it's been done. Well, my postdoc's done it, and he's done amazing work, right? So as you can see, we brought them in there, black caps, and the difference are there. The difference in caching amount, so birds from Alaska still cache more in a lab. They've grown in the same little cages. They have the same food. Alaska birds still cache more food, and they actually show much better spatial memory, right? That argues against the simple environmental things, right? You can see a number of neurons, even more striking differences, right? So you can see that Kansas birds, whether they're common garden or wild, there's no difference in number of neurons, and the same in Alaska. So that also is arguing, because there's a lot of concept within at least biomedical literature, right, saying captivity, impoverished environment, affecting on this, and it does. The question is, what does it affect to? And our work shows that it does not affect the number of neurons. and I'll talk a little bit more about this because I think what captivity in impoverished environment does affect, it's dendritic branching, it's the connections, right? But not the neurons themselves. The neurons themselves are still staying there, right? And again, in this case, we have birds that spend their entire life in a cage and birds that spend their entire life in wilderness of Alaska. They have the same number of neurons, statistically speaking, right? So it's very interesting. Then what do we find? Mountain chickadees, we actually have not done common garden experiment. We simply compared captive populations and wild populations. And one thing you can see that in the hippocampal volume definitely shrinks in captivity. That's actually been known, documented. And again, I do think it's shrinking because of connection, of pruning of dendritic connections, but not number of neurons. Right, so in a way, what one can argue that we're dealing with some kind of adaptive mechanisms where a number of neurons stays, then when there's a lot of environmental interactions, enrichment, then they spring out all these connections, and when there's none of that, they just shrink, but they're there, right? And if you think about it from, again, adaptive perspective, it's much quicker to actually prune dendrites. It takes sometimes several minutes, classical work with hormones, but it's not easy to bring new neurons. It takes, in birds and small passenger birds, it takes about 30 days from a new neuron being produced until it actually incorporates into the neural circuit, right? So that's a long time. But anyway, we see very similar differences kind of arguing against it. So here you can also see this is a black-capped chickadee from south, and this is from the north. Just going to show you, taken from this exactly the same spot within the hippocampus. So you can see way more neurons in a northern bird, and they're much bigger as well, right? You can see, you don't even need statistics on this. This is what we call, eyeballing these things. Of course, we do have statistics, but the data are very drastic. I mean, the differences are not small. They're big. They're in your face, right? So very, very interesting in that way. So we've been arguing that because the environment or the experience and we've manipulated that doesn't affect number of neurons, that means that number of neurons controlled by some genetic program, some genetic developmental mechanism. And if that's the case, it should be affected, or it could be affected by selection, right? Because if something is not being affected by environment or by experiences and it's more stable, but yet we see variation in that, then selection has a chance to potentially weed out some with less, or fewer neurons and some with more neurons, right? And so, in other words, our data, at least preliminary data, are very consistent with the idea of natural selection acting on a very small spatial scale, right? On these very highly resident birds. So, but again, like I said, I came from truly the wild, spending 6 months in the snow and in the wild, into the lab, doing all this neurobiology. But at the same time, watching birds in the lab convinces me that they're not, well, most animals, they don't do the same thing as they do in natural conditions, right? And in a way, when you think about it, right, so we have to deprive them, we have to stimulate them so they can do the task. We may pretend whatever it is, but it's not the real thing. It's not what they're facing in real conditions. And so the idea would be, can we do this in the wild? Can we test spatial cognition in the wild? And while when I started years and years ago, I thought it would be completely crazy, but now with RFID technology, actually it has become possible. So we took our whole paradigm. So that's the last several years we've been working only in the field. So we're not bringing any birds into the lab. What we're doing is we've created a paradigm to test spatial memory directly in the field in hundreds of birds by using PIT tags and RFID technology. So we can see that's one of our design. Of course, all of our work is gorgeous in the winter, so we are lucky to use snow machines and skiing and doing all these things. Of course, we're also lucky that we have to take data and fix electronic problems when it's minus 20 and blowing wind and snow, and you have to take all your gloves off and use very small screwdrivers and trying to fix these things. But that just comes with territory, right? But anyway, what you can see here, what we call them spatial arrays. So I'm not going to go too much. I've removed a lot of videos before how we came. So this all suspended. We have lots of bears in there. They don't like these things. They like sunflower seeds. They don't like us. So if they can get to it, they destroy it. And we spend the whole season just trying to figure out how to actually not have bears destroy our stuff. And we've learned that bears have very high level of cognition. So, but we were better. We're not unique, but we were better. In other words, as I claim, we won. We won the battle. So the way we won it is, you can see we suspend the whole thing about 20 feet up in the air, and the bears can climb the trees, but the bears don't have good vision. They use their nose, and because of suspension, they climb right in line with food. They couldn't figure out that there are these cords connected above this, and so they fail. And then we just drop it on the pulley system, and so we can get the data. So the thing here, what you see is you have 8 feeders. It's kind of like a radial maze. We couldn't do circle. They're all equidistant. So each feeder has an RFID antenna, an RFID board. We program the RFID board that it only provides food to an individual that we want to, and it doesn't feed anybody else. So think about it as a radial maze, right? So the bird goes on that thing, it lands on 1 feeder or 2 feeders, only 1 feeder will open food for it. But each feeder will record when the bird came in. So we have a beautiful learning curve. So we say the bird came in, and it went 1, 2, 3, reward, trials in, right? Comes again, goes 1, 2, reward. So we can count errors very easily, right? Birds, we don't need to stimulate them. They're very eager to help us. They complete thousands of trials. We get so much data, we don't know what to do with this. I'm not a computational biologist. Now my requirements, my students and postdocs to know programming and computational biology. We're dealing with millions of data lines in these things with these birds. But anyway, so you can see here's in the design. So we have this little P tags that have color band. Right, so the bird lands, that's antenna, that we build everything ourselves, the bird lands on it, it reads it, gives us a timestamp, and it either opens the door or it doesn't. Birds learn like this, that's how it works. They show learning, and we can do a variety of different tests on them, well, definitely in terms of spatial memory, right? So by looking at number of errors and seeing how they learn with a number of trials, and we see learning, we see very good learning. So inside of this, you can basically just see basic RFID board, antenna connected to it, then we have the motor controller, and basically all, not very complex technology, but it works beautifully well, and we can get what we want, right? So here's our stages, how we're using this. So we first train all the birds, feeders are all open, right? So they know there's food, they come in there. Then we close all the feeders, but we let all of them open, so the birds will get used to the mechanism, to the noise of the doors, so they can land on any feeder, and every feeder will open, it doesn't matter which one. And then we'll start spatial learning by rewarding just 1 feeder. And all of a sudden birds come in there and that doesn't give food. And to avoid to prevent social learning, every bird has a unique feeder. So they don't all get the same feeder. Otherwise they can just all follow everybody else. So they don't follow, right? So, right. And basically we just count trials. In the winter, birds are very, very, very motivated. As you can see, here's one of my students. They will land on you and they'll come just everywhere. When we get data, they will try to get inside the feeders, and so very cooperative. We have big sample size with this, lots of measurements, right? In the real conditions. Well, psychologists could argue potentially that we're not controlling the environment, and yes, we're not controlling the environment. We're testing it in the real environment. The strength of this, I think, is by testing hundreds of individuals over many, many years, which we do. And right now we have birds that are 4 years old that we've tested for 3-4 years, and younger birds. We actually may see if there's a selection acting on these traits. In other words, if birds that have better cognition indeed survive better or reproduce better. And if that's the case, we should be able to show that there's some selection on it, right? So this is all the design. You can see how it works. So the birds land on it. You can see this thing's open. And it gives food. Then the thief comes, but the thieves wouldn't get food unless, again, the antenna will open. All right. First question is there variation? The answer is yes, tons of variation. Individuals vary a lot in how fast they learn. So we have low and high. We have what we call as arrays, 2 arrays of each elevation. So if there's variation, well, that's cool. That's good. That's a good start, right? So we can see something. So then can we see that they do better at initial learning, as we showed in the lab? And the answer is yes, they do. High elevation birds, at least on our first season when we looked at it, definitely learn the location of the initial target. And I'll tell them why we call it initial target very quickly, right? How do we know they're using spatial memory, right? So in other words, maybe they're using something else. Maybe they remember the feeder giving them a location. So what we do is a traditional standard, again, lab approach into the field. We rotate the whole array, right? We train the birds to come to a particular feeder, and then we just rotate it 180 degrees and test them again. If they use spatial memory, they now should come to a new feeder, but in the same location. If they follow the feeder, that's something they remember about that feeder, they should follow where the feeder is. And there, right? So you can see that's how it changes. And the answer is yes, they absolutely use spatial memory. No matter how you move the feeders, they go and they use some other cues. I'm not going to talk more about this. There are going to be other speakers now within school that study specifically which mechanisms birds use to find these things, right? We're just interested in how well they do it and what are the consequences of how well they do it. So we change slightly. We keep changing these designs, but it's better. But I'll bring you another question, right? So flexibility. It's a big thing now, at least within behavioral ecology and cognitive ecology. It's a big thing. Everybody thinks that flexibility is great. Psychologists define flexibility initially based on reversal learning. That's been contested now, so to a point where Louis Lefebvre argues that we shouldn't use the word behavioral flexibility, but instead we should be more specific, which I agree. All right, but in our case, it's interesting that as I start reading more, it looks like different species differ. Some species are better at initial learning, but worse at reversal learning, and other species are better at reversal learning, but not as good at retention. And that gave us some ideas to see if there's a trade-off, right? So again, what's reversal learning, right? So it's again, so what you do is you train the animal to learn one location, and then you change it. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, everything's hunky-dory, food is always there, and like, oops, it's not there anymore. How fast can they learn new association, right? Reversal learning, right? And so then we can ask questions, is flexibility always good, and whether it comes with different costs, right? So, and the concept of interference is important in this case. So very traditional psychological approach, not quite appreciated within behavioral ecology community, within evolutionary biology community, definitely well tested in humans. So what is proactive interference? Proactive interference is if you learn something and remember it, and then you try to learn new thing that is very similar, you may have difficulties remembering it. Think about your phone number. If you have a phone number and you change a new phone number, but you only change one digit, you're going to have difficulties potentially remembering that for a while, right? The old memories will come back. It will kind of haunt you in certain ways, right? So, right? So, and then we have retroactive interference when animals acquiring new memory may interfere with older memories, right? New memories come in, then you forget the old stuff. So why it's important, right? So it's important that in our food caching paradigm, if the animals have to remember a lot of stuff and remember it well, they may have to deal with a lot of proactive interference. In other words, by stuffing their brains with memories of hundreds of thousands of cache locations may potentially have costs, right? So by making animals potentially less flexible, right? So, and in that way, we may expect, as when we started, that high elevation birds that cache more food and remember it may actually deal worse with interference and be less flexible, right? And so we found exactly that. So when we compared them on initial learning and in one season, there was no difference, but high elevation birds, indeed, it took them longer to acquire a reversal learning task, right? So you can see this in the first 20 trials. You can clearly see that high elevation birds, if they learn fast, but they were doing worse than low elevation birds. It took them more time to learn it. The question is why, right? And if they are not learning it well, where do they go? And what we found is that they're going to the old feeder, which makes sense for proactive interference. They go where they think food is, and they are not willing to give it up. They keep going there more, right? And that's what makes them worse at flexibility. So you can here see a correlation. Basically, the birds, individual birds that were more likely to go to the old location didn't do as well at reversal learning. But at the same time, if you think about sampling, the way they sample the environment is exactly the same between elevations. So if you give them all the feeders, they'll close and see how they learn, they will do the same thing. They'll just come to one feeder. Even though all of them will give them food, they're not going to sample too much. In other words, the differences that we see here in reversal learning are not based on difference in sampling. That's definitely based on some cognitive mechanism that is interfering with them doing so, right? So, all right, so we replicated the result. Very interesting result, caused some controversy. Some reviewers didn't like it, didn't believe it, so we wanted to replicate this in the second year. Again, it's a field work. Well, we were able to replicate it. So in the second season, high elevation birds did better in the initial learning, as we expect, as we've shown before. But as you can see, those are the number of feeders to all different feeders, right? So this is the first 5 trials versus first 20 trials. And it's kind of messy, but it shows you where do they go as they learn. Because when they go first, they go to a random feeder. Then they go to the next random feeder. And then they find something, right? So we're trying to see if there's a pattern. And in this case, we specifically want to compare adults and juveniles. And that's one of the ideas potentially that we can test selection by comparing age structures. Adults, those are the birds that survived already a year, right? The question is why they survived. And juveniles was the first-year birds. So we can see in the initial task, there's no difference how they sample. Those are the errors that they make to all these feeders. So they sample it the same way. On the reversal learning, again, low elevation birds did better, made fewer errors than high elevation birds, but the difference were specifically unique to age groups. So in other words, juvenile birds at both elevations did much worse, and adults did much better in this case, right? So you can see here, surviving versus adults, or adults versus juveniles, right? Again, now we're looking where they make mistakes. Now we're looking specifically at mistakes at the initial target, right? That's where food used to be, but not there anymore. And that's where the errors are made. So the juvenile birds keep going to the old location where adults switch much faster, right? So that's interesting. The question, of course, is why, right? So we argue that this data suggests that adults, we're talking about 50% switch, right, in population. They're dying very quickly. So to me, that suggests that reversal learning is more important than initial learning in these birds, right? So we look at retention. We actually didn't find difference in retention in the field, so we just covered it, like you see this with tarps. The field is different and unique. We have to deal with challenges. We just covered the tarp, put a separate feeder on the side, so the birds stay, and then we uncover it and see if they remember. They remember well, but they remember both initial and reversal targets, and they don't discriminate between them, which means that their memories may be confused in these two things. They're still having difficulties in doing so, right? But anyway, so it looks like reversal may be important, right? So I know I'm going to show this very kind of complex things, right, that we were trying to do, and that brings neurogenesis and forgetting in place. As I was saying before, so high elevation birds or northern birds, they have to remember so much information. The question is if that's introducing problems in flexibility, that's a problem because the burden of memory makes them less flexible. That maybe not as good for them, right? And so in a way, we can think that selection may actually try to act to minimize those effects. And that's where neurogenesis comes in place. They have much higher neurogenesis at high elevation, but they're worse at reversal learning. So if neurogenesis, the data suggests, is specifically introducing forgetting, and again, remember, if these birds will catch hundreds of thousands of seeds in a year, then they'll recover them. The initial ideas were that these birds have to remember both caches that are there and the ones that they've recovered. And that's been going for years. And when I started thinking about this, it made no sense. Because if you recovered, there's nothing there. It's much better to forget it. Because it's like, right, if you took something out of there, why would you remember that you took out of there? Because actually, it's much better not to remember in this case. So if that's the case, then high neurogenesis makes perfect sense because they recover at a much higher rate at high elevation. That is associated with much higher neurogenesis. That allows these birds to become a little bit more flexible. So in other words, it counteracts the effects of more memory retention, right? So in other words, forgetting becomes very important. And it's important. Human literature, and like why we forget some information, not forget other information. So when we think about neurogenesis, it's also very interesting because when we think about neuronal replacement, it's not random. It's not just like neurons are being replaced randomly. Some neurons are being replaced, some not. There's some data in molecular literature about communication between precursors of neurons and dying cells. So the dying cell communicates to the new neuron that I'm dying, and that cell comes and replaces it, right? Then the question that's interesting, right? Which ones are important? Because for birds, forgetting caches is great, but it's not good to forget their mate or where the shelters are. So some information should stay, some should go, right? And so that makes it very interesting from both mechanistic perspective and from evolutionary perspective. But anyway, so but what I want to also kind of say that at least when we think about the evolution of cognition, right? And again, I'm specifically talking not about what animal can do, but why some animals are better than other animals. Then the environment is important. And so even when we, previous talks or other talks in the summer school, right? So these animals, they have theory of mind or whatnot. But if there's difference between species or there's difference between populations, we should ask the question why this difference is there, right? So it's not what they learn. In other words, what can evolve? And what can evolve is the ability, for example, to remember. Or what can evolve is a neural substrate, right? So under selection that may allow animals to process high-level cognition or any level cognition with what we can talk, right? So in food caching species, I think what's important is that food caching itself, which frequently is taken out of the equation when people are talking about corvids, for example, right? So lots of work that many of you are familiar was done with scrub jays. Scrub jays are highly specialized food cacher. So most of that cognition can be much easy explained by their biology of food caching than by other things. Because, for example, other feature not frequently discussed, the scrub jays are not social. Scrub jays actually living in pairs. They're territorial. They're very, I mean, juncos are much more social, and juncos don't have any of that cognition at all, right? And so in some ways, at least within my work, my argument is that it's frequently better to understand variation cognition based on the ecology and environment and life history of particular species that we're discussing, why that may be the case. And then look for similarities based on that, right? So not just trying to necessarily say that, that corvids are feathered apes, because then rats can do everything that corvids can do. And so we can argue that, that rats are featherless corvids, or we can make all this type of arguments, right? So not to say, again, I think it's just exaggerating certain things, kind of coming back to the previous talk, and neglecting other things is not giving us much justice in trying to understand evolution of cognition and what animals are capable of doing it, right? Especially when we're looking at a continuum, when we think that evolution of cognition and minds occurs gradually, but occurs gradually based on difference in the environment and not just random, right? So, or whether it's a social environment or physical environment, like in our case, that would affect that. But it has to evolve from something. It doesn't just show up. It doesn't just, they just don't invent, it's not like hippocampus just pops up and it's there, right? It already was there, except that if there's a selection, then we can see some species or some populations with bigger hippocampi and better cognitive abilities in that particular task. So I'm not saying the chickadees are better at some, I don't know, theory of mind, but they're definitely better at spatial learning than many, many other animals. But then again, their life depends on it. And when we talk about food caching, right, and in chickadees in particular, they're very hardwired. So there's all evidence that caching propensity itself or desire to cache is genetic, which is actually interesting to the point where at some time, one of my colleagues from biomedical suggested this is a perfect model for compulsive obsessive disorder that we see in humans, because these birds cannot not cache. So if you don't give them food, they'll cache rocks, they'll cache bolts. Anything you give to them, they will try to cache, and because they're so driven to do that. And so in that way, it's specialized, right? So it may not be, as broad as widespread. It's very specialized for the task, but it's one of the cognitive features, and so we can potentially investigate and gain in trying to study cognition by bringing ecology, by bringing environment into the realm, and trying to again to understand why the difference there, right? So in a way, again, if you think about old questions, for a lot of old comparative psychology in the past, psychologists were interested in why things are the same, what are the generalities among species, but as equally important is to understand why species are different. Only by looking at both ends of this continuum, we can kind of to bring better understanding. So I think probably used an hour. So I mean, I have more data. Sure.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I'm just curious, there's other little birds up in these areas that are sympatric with these chickadees, and they're not cachers, right? Like the nuthatches and
nuthatches are cachers.
They don't cache.
No, nuthatches do cache.
Oh, they do.
Yes.
But juncos don't.
And they don't stay there in the winter. They're all down.
Oh, okay. So is it all little birds that manage to survive in northern climates, or for that matter, southern ones? Do they all cache?
No, because it's a matter of, first of all, it's a matter of the harshness of the climate. And of course, there's a lot of other adaptations that animals have. But when we talk about fully resident, non-migratory species, yes, they do.
Okay.
There are other species that have other physiological adaptations to cold and different metabolism that can do this. But usually they will move. They'll move with food, like red poles or like juncos. They will stay there, very opportunistic, or crossbills, right? Chickadees are unique in a way, which is true for other caching species, that they don't move. They stay. They basically stay in the same area, which makes sense. Again, if you invest in 100,000 caches, why would you move? You're going to lose everything.
So one very, I guess, practical question rooted in my own life history, also growing up in a very harsh climate similar to yourself. So I was always amazed that the Chickadees were the first things out after the harshest storms and -40, and how did they survive? I'm wondering if you've looked at, or anyone has looked at, energetics in the sense of, you would predict then from your stuff about caching and length of day that the cache retrieval frequency would be inversely proportional to the length of day, or at least harshness. Is that true?
I would agree with you, but it's very difficult to test, right? Because once you're doing it in the wild, to actually test recovery in the wild is nearly impossible, because we cannot see what they do. Theoretical models that I worked on do suggest that, yes, that they should recover more. And of course, also, as you mentioned, I think it's naive to think that cognition is the only mechanism that works. We also well know that there's definitely other physiological machinery, and particularly the fat metabolism is very different in Chickadees that are living farther north. And one of the classical, that I know, at least the anecdote story, at some point, some people wanted to do experiment to see this, and they brought Seattle birds to Fairbanks, put them in the outdoor aviaries, and gave them all the food that they want, and they all died. So they just couldn't handle it. So it's not just food, right? So there's definitely a more complex phenotype that's being developed, and we are fully aware of this, and we're very interested. So in particular, right now, we're thinking about giving the cost of genomic scanning that's so low. We want to sequence genome, but not necessarily just to find it, but more like pointing us in the right direction where other things that may be different by looking at difference in within the genome. Things. We've done transcriptomics in Alaska Chickadees and Kansas. We found significant differences in gene expression, specifically linked to metabolic genes and in the brain, and genes linked to neurogenesis and neuronal maintenance.
Good. So that I think is a good launching point for my second question, which is this whole issue of neurogenesis and forgetting and having large number of caches to deal with. So I don't know how many caches these guys are retrieving on a daily basis. Must be tens or something.
It could be more. I mean, once you use feeders, of course, they stay at the feeders. So these birds also highly opportunistic. Every time you have any ephemeral food source, they will not touch their caches, which makes sense. If you stored your food, but somebody's giving you other food, why would you touch yours? You're going to go and continue storing, and that's what they're doing, right? But I think in the wild, if there's no other food source, there will be.
So my question is, so given that they're doing tens of cache retrievals per day, they're faced with the issue of, how do I not revisit caches that I've retrieved? And it feels like a stretch to say, well, neurogenesis takes care of the problem. They just quickly forget. I would expect that, at least on the initial time scale, they have to actively remember, this is a location that I visited, so therefore I'm going to visit a new location. And then maybe eventually neurogenesis will overwrite the places that they've retrieved.
Well, neurogenesis occurs very intensely, right? So because there's two interesting things, right? So one thing that is, and I like this long-term ago. So if I ask you a question, is it better to have memory but make mistakes, or imperfect memory, or have no memory? What do you think is better? And if you don't know the answer is it's better to have no memory. In other words,
it depends on the error rate.
Yes, because for example, if you hid keys in your apartment, but you don't quite remember, if you had some errors, you will be searching where you think you hid them. If your memory is wrong, you're going to spend all the time searching in that area. Then bring somebody who doesn't know anything about this and ask them to find the keys. They will find it reliably faster than you, right? And so the idea would be this: for them to remember recovered caches, that's kind of a flawed thing, because if they remember other caches, they don't need to remember which was recovered. They can just keep going to new ones. Right. So again, I mean, that's all speculation. Obviously, it's very difficult to test. And you may be right. There may be some faint memory of these locations, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of caches. We're talking about lots and lots of caches. The idea would be that if neurogenesis and forgetting is not just because they don't need to remember it, but it's more helping them to be more flexible, because flexibility is important, but they're being held back by these very big memories. What can be tested, at least objectively, is whether memory load can affect these processes, because that we can do. And we can do it in the wild, actually, so because we can try to manipulate memory load experimentally and see if that's the case, right? But forgetting, that's the thing, as I start reading, but how do you test forgetting? It's so hard. There's human literature, but it's very difficult.
Visiting a cache that you've actually previously emptied is a sign of error, right? So you'd have to put a whole bunch of artificial caches out, and then monitor rate of revisit of an emptied cache.
Right, but also we should remember, right, that unlike the lab where we make this very distinct cache sites, there are no cache sites in the field. They cache everywhere. They're caching in the bark, between the needles, so there's no site, so to speak, right? It's a continuum. So we're thinking about birds covering a big range with lots and lots of big trees, and the cache is scattered everywhere, right? So it's not like one location that they can revisit. So one can talk about multitude of subserving memory mechanisms that allows them to do that, right? So potentially where they can just go like us, right? You can go and say, oh yeah, I mean, I remember this, right? So, but they may need to be in a particular location and close to particular cues to find it. Because the whole idea of remembering this much, I mean, I know we'll talk about it, but in the lab, nobody shows that they can remember 100,000 seeds, right? But they do cache them, and we know that they are the ones who recover. There's some beautiful methods been done to show that there's little stealing going on, but not much. So they definitely recover them. The big question is, do they remember all of this, or it's many different things, right? Like, again, if you are like here in this particular room, you say, oh, now I remember because I'm here. That triggers the events of memory that now you can immediately bring it to the next level and then to the next level, right? But again, I think that it's misleading in a way to think about allocation because it's continuous. And so the way that the chickadee forages in the woods, it's not like it comes in a cage and it comes in the middle of the aviary. They move constantly. They move the entire time. They all day, that's all they do. They move around their territory and they eat. So in the winter, at least my older work, so the bird will eat a food item every minute to 2 minutes throughout the entire day. That's a lot of eating as well, right? So again, I mean, it's interesting. So it's kind of how fast neurogenesis leads to forget. In rats, very fast actually. They can be forced to forget by inducing or slowing neurogenesis very quickly. So it's at least it's possible, right? So it's an interesting mechanism, but I think that there's not a very high probability of them making errors like this because there's so many of these caches, and B, they're not drawn to a particular one, like here's 5 locations in the aviary or 10. We're talking about billions of things all over the place, where I think that memory is much more complex than we truly understand. And I don't think it's just like they wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to go to this corner of the wood on that one tree, and I'm going to go to that area, and I'm going to find it. No, so they're going to pop up in the tree when they spend the night. They go to the next tree and say, oh, I'm here. Oh, and then right here, I remember that there's a few things that I just stashed there, and then they're going to go and look for it.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, you said that when it comes to neural substrate, there is much more variability than in the mechanism. But isn't the neural substrate the foundation which will determine the sophistication of the mechanism?
No, what I said is that performance or behavior, there's much more variability. I said that neural substrate is much less variable, actually, compared to behavior.
Okay.
And so, and that's one of the reasons where we measured like number of neurons. So because it's just more reliable when you can test it, when it doesn't depend. Because testing animal cognition in wild animals in the lab is a tricky thing. And maybe rats or zebra finches, but truly bringing animals into captivity and think they're not affected is naive. They're definitely affected, right? And spending a lot of time watching them, I definitely see that, they're not acting normal. I mean, many of them may not act normal, and that's why variation is there, right? Motivation is a giant underappreciated factor. So I don't know, motivation is not realm of cognition, but actually a lot of current literature that I see, things like problem solving, innovations. In 90% of this, I can see that motivation, to me, at least appears to be the main factor, not difference in cognition. Because if the animal doesn't want to do anything, it's not going to do it. And you're going to interpret this as bad cognition, right? So if you, let's say, if I put a chickadee in the room and ask it to recover seeds, but it doesn't want to eat. Well, it's not going to search, or it may go and search specifically other sites. For example, I'll give you one example. I've seen these cases. So I had like 80 sites that are available to birds. I've had examples where the bird had food in one site, right? And when I ask it to solve the task, it will open 70 unrewarded sites and not touch the rewarded sites. So if you can interpret it that they don't know what they're doing, or you can interpret they know exactly what they're doing because they're not touching the only one site that has food, but they're opening everything else, right? So how to interpret this? And again, that's motivational is a big factor. So we've tried a while ago to control motivation by comparing animal performance on two different tasks, color and spatial. Color is different processing throughout the brain. So the idea would be that if animals are motivated to find food, but they just can't, then if you give them a different task, there should be no differences, right? Because then they all of a sudden like, oh, here it is, I see it, I'm gonna get it. Well, if they really don't care, they shouldn't care. And we've done it, and we definitely showed that this difference in chickadees, they do equally well on color tests and not equally well on spatial tasks. But most scientists don't do motivational tests and a lot of cognitive tests, and I think motivation is important. And doing things in the field in a way gives a much higher level of motivation because animals are normally motivated when they come there because they're hungry and it's in the winter, right? So, but again, one can argue that then we have different years and we have different snow years, we had drought, we just talked about this, so we've just published a paper on 5 years of reproduction, and in 5 years in Sierra Nevada, we had the biggest drought in 150 years and the biggest snow year in 100 years, all within just 5 years. And these birds definitely respond to it because that's a big thing, right? The other thing is what they cache, in our case, mountain chickadees, they cache pine seeds. So pine cycles. So most pine species produce reliable crop every third year, which means that some years there's nothing for them to cache or very little to cache. Other years, there's tons of seeds to cache. So last year we had birds who wouldn't barely come to our feeders. Everything, I mean, you would go in the snow and the snow is covered with pine seeds because all the pines produce crops, right? So how all of this, generate all these different variances, yeah. But yeah, sorry, kind of on, but neural substrate, in my opinion, is more stable. It still varies, of course. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you. Did you investigate the effect of environmental volatility and of expected and unexpected uncertainty on the effect or on the interspecific difference in learning and flexibility?
Uncertainty in food?
Yeah, and reward.
Yes, well, we showed that a while ago I did an experiment where if I change the perception of them to unpredictable food by giving food at random periods, they do better on memory.
But on the maybe neurogenesis or neuronal renewal rate?
We didn't see the changes in morphology. We didn't look at the neurogenesis at that time. But what we did look is hormones. So when you make food unpredictable, our birds and many other animals will elevate level of glucocorticoids just because of that. And so what we've shown that if you, like I said, now experiment, if we separate a day, let's say 8 hours of day into like blocks, and then randomly provide food only for 5 minutes within a block, we show that A, birds do better on spatial memory tests, B, they cache more food, C, they elevate significantly cord level, and D, when we repeat the experiment by providing them with cord implants, we replicated the whole thing. So what seemed to be the case that on this temporary scale, at least, the hormones can mediate memory performance. So the way that I see this again is that, and of course it's also well known because cord can affect the neural connections and all the communications, synaptic connections as well. But I also think that there are two different levels. So you can see one level where we can see difference in number of neurons, for example, right? And then within that, we have these oscillations that are based on other mechanisms, like hormonal mechanisms, right? And so selection may not necessarily act on that directly, even though it may, because again, we're talking about trade-offs, right? They're elevating stress hormones may lead to other potentially negative consequences. But animals are well known to elevate cord level, and despite that sometimes people say cord actually impairs memory, it only impairs memory when administered in clinical doses, like in early studies and biomedical studies. But modulations of cord within normal range have been linked, including our study, linked to better cognition.
not really related to cognition, but in primatology we have apes and we have monkeys, and the comparisons between the two is really delicate, and we try not to, to compare the two taxa with each other. Now, I was wondering if in birds there was this same kind of threshold in taxonomy where this group can be, every species can be compared to each other easily, and then once you hit another taxa, it's like, you have to be careful.
Well, I think in birds, corvids are feathered apes, which I think it's not right? So, but and I've written a review on a book that my friend Nathan published. You may have seen about the corvids, and he was not happy with my review because I said he's biased, and he said that I am biased, and I said yes, I'm a reviewer, and I have a right to be biased, just like you have a right. You have a right to be biased in your way, and I brought out other. But yeah, so in that way it is. So if you see now corvids, I mean, you literally do anything in corvids, and it's published in Science and Nature and everywhere, and then like all of a sudden now you read these papers and they're not good. Like, I don't know whether you've noticed, there was a paper just recently published in corvids and ravens, and of course ravens, I mean, they're great, and I love ravens. I do think that they're smart. It's subjective, but anyway, they said that the ravens can plan for the future. It was published in Science. And then 2 months later, Robert Hampton, who's a great psychologist, published this parallel flaws, and he basically showed the experimental design used in the study was completely insufficient to show that, because basically the way they did the studies, they train ravens that if they are giving particular tokens, whatever series of tokens, they will always get reward after these tokens, and then when they're given other tokens, they would never get reward. But then after training them, they gave them a choice which one to pick. And of course, they picked the ones that gave them reward, but they concluded that means they plan for the future. But of course, the most logical explanation, whether it's right or wrong, right, is that, of course, they've been rewarded what they're going to pick, right? So it just, again, I mean, I think we should be careful in interpretations. Again, the separation is definitely real. The corvids are considered, like apes, right? But then again, somebody can ask, what about parrots? What about other birds? So, some of it may be Calderian crows, tool use, right? So we've seen chickadees using these little tools, right? So in the lab, they would pick a stick and try to get a seed from the hole in there. So, I mean, I just think we have to be careful how we separate things and really bring knowledge kind of to say, okay, corvids, now again, corvids, apes, parallel evolution, but we've shown a bunch of things with chickadees that do the same thing as corvids. Are chickadees as smart as corvids? I mean, I don't know. They're pretty smart. They can definitely do a lot of things. They recognize, again, if we talk about, they recognize each other. They communicate very, have complex communication. It's been shown that their communication actually contains words, because chickadees, among birds, actually have a syntax in their call, which is amazing, right? And you can replicate the syntax. You can actually manipulate syntax like you would do in human speech, and it's been shown that they actually respond to particular things. In other words, they know if one chickadee says, food is here, all chickadees around know that. Or if a chickadee says, hey, here's Bill there, they know that, right? So again, they have amazing memories. We've shown problem solving and a standard kind of what everybody does. They do this all just fine, right? So for their own thing, but they don't recognize themselves in the mirror. So what does it mean? Gorillas don't recognize themselves in the mirror, but chimps do.
Yeah.
Sorry if I don't know whether I answered your question.
Great, thanks.
So for neurogenesis, there's a signaling that a neuron is dying. There's a replacement of that neuron. Does the new neuron grow into the pre-existing connections in the place of the old one, or some of them? Or
so neurogenesis is a very interesting thing, right? So for most neurons in the neurogenesis process die, and it puzzled people, right? So because at least in rodents and in a lot of birds, there's a lot of neurogenesis, adult neurogenesis, right? So, but many of them die, and people are saying, well, how come? So as I mentioned before, right, so for the neuron, so all the new neurons start from these precursor cells, right, which are sitting in this ventricular zone. So it takes about, the rat is shorter, I think maybe in a rat it's 2 weeks, and bird takes about 30 days for that neuron from the birth to actually become fully functional neuron. So the idea that, I forgot the name, person who kind of introduced it, that neurogenesis produces kind of like a river, right? So in other words, there's always pipeline of neurons on different stages of development. So when the cells in the hippocampus are dying, they're signaling to these cells, and whoever is ready within that river comes and takes its place, right? And by doing so, they can do it quickly, they can do it efficiently, right? But if there's no need, if the cell is not dying, then these new cells are just dying. They are being born, they mature, they migrate, but they don't incorporate, and then they just die. So the answer is no. Actually, majority of cells do not incorporate. Only minority of them incorporate. And the interesting question, again, I'm not the biggest expert in this, but I'm trying to follow this. That communication, to me, that's the most exciting thing, right? How that communication occurs between cells, right? Because it looks like, and what triggers the death of neuron. The experiments shown that if you experimentally increase apoptosis or death of old neurons, that triggers high neurogenesis. And on the other side, if you experimentally allow the old neurons longer survival, it slows neurogenesis down. So in other words, these new neurons are not pushing the old one out. It's the old ones that are calling for the new ones to come in, which is very interesting. I think there's still kind of questions. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. Unfortunately, studied only in rats, but on the other hand, it does require a lot of killing kind of things and a lot of animals, because every time you do this, you can't study this in live animals.
So the old idea that there wasn't neurogenesis in adult humans, was there ever a basis in
There was a paper very recent, it's an old argument, but I believe it was debunked as well. Well, of course, right, so absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There's lots of debates. Some people think that we have, in humans, we have neurogenesis when we're younger, and then we do not. I don't know for sure. Actually, to me, in my thinking kind of now with forgetting and things, it kind of makes sense, because in rats, it's been shown that in juvenile rats, neurogenesis is much higher than in adults, right? And when you think as we grow, we do sift through a lot of experiences, a lot of memories. Some of them stay with us, some of them go away. Once we become adults, actually more memories stay with us until we reach senile age, and then we start just forgetting everything, which also been linked to neurogenesis, by the way. In the Alzheimer disease has been linked in problems with neurogenesis as well. So maybe one way to look at it specifically, like I said, what kind of memories different species use and in humans. So I mean, potentially it does make sense to me in adult humans, neurogenesis should be very low. Unlike a chickadee that caches 100,000 seeds every year, and it doesn't reuse them year next, right? So which means they start anew every year, which means they have to remember those, and then these memories have to go away, because otherwise it makes no sense for them, because to keep them for 5 years, right? So in that way, realistically at least, or ecologically, it does make sense they will have much higher neurogenesis that just does this clearance. Think about it also as a song learning, and song learning, I think it's the only unique thing where the HVC is being built by neurogenesis every spring. And so in other words, it adds neurons. In the hippocampus, it doesn't just add, it replaces, but in the song brain nuclei, it actually builds them, and then it discards them. It builds them every spring, and in the fall, they fall off, which is very interesting and very unique. I mean, I'm not aware of any other group that does the same thing. So song learning is truly an independent way to generate the song learning type of things, even though the outcome may be very similar to other animals and speech production and other things.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. Would you say that food caching is a form of planning for the future or not?
Of course.
But
it's again, right? So, and that's where ecology meets cognition. Evolutionary, of course, is planning for the future, but the question is, when the animal does it know that, right? Yeah. So does it intend to do this because? And I think food caching in some birds, like chickadees, is hardwired. But it's not only chickadees, because, for example, when we look at corvids, another species that's very neglected and Canada, being in Canada especially, it's been just renamed to Canada jay. And you probably know the bird, right? So it used to be gray jay. Well, it used to be Canada jay, it was gray jay, and now it's officially Canada jay again. And it's a gorgeous food caching corvid that actually is very adapted to caching. They have salivary glands, and every fall the salivary glands grow significantly. They cache not seeds, they cache actual live material. They cache invertebrates, vertebrates, berries. They will put them in their pouch, wrap them in saliva, and then glue them to the bottom of the branches. So saliva serves to prevent oxygen access to the caches, so they can stay longer. And it's interesting because now with warming, global warming, for example, in Algonquin Park, the jays are rolling up north. And what they showed is because these caches cannot survive the winter. They're rotting. But these birds are so hardwired on caches. They breed in the winter. They breed in January and February when there's tons of snow. The female sitting on nest covered. So they feed the young, and the male feeds the female using 100% caches, only caches, right? So they're also hardwired caches. They're corvids, but they're like chickadees in the way. So I think in those species, I don't know whether I could call it planning because they're really there. It's like obsessive behavior. So in that way, I think it is a good definition because they just have to do it. But I don't think they're doing it. At least I don't think they're like, oh, I need more caches. They just driven to cache. It's like hunger, right? So for example, in humans and all birds, and when we don't eat food, glucose level drops. That results in production of glucocorticoids, and then you're like, oh, I'm hungry. And we go eat, right? So in a way, there may be similar and simple mechanism that initiates caching.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for a really stimulating talk. I was particularly interested in the way you're doing your experiments in the wild now, which I commend you for. And I had never thought that having reversal learning could have costs, and it wouldn't be a sign of advanced cognition. So that I just learned an awful lot from your talk. I have a bunch of questions. Let me just ask two, and you can choose which one you want, or maybe I'll just ask one to start. It follows up on the question about what the bird's thinking. Is it thinking about its future? I'm going to talk about cows thinking about their future tonight. So I'm interested to hear you speculate a little bit more. I think I heard you say something like the bird doesn't wake up in the morning and think, oh, I'm going to go to sites A, B, C, and then Q, T, and Z today. It wakes up and thinks, oh, I cached over there, so I'll go over there and look. And when it gets there, then it thinks, oh, I cached over there, so it goes there. Is that a fair characterization of what you're speculating?
No, actually, I'm arguing that it's not the case.
Good.
I'm actually saying that the bird just gets out. It literally just flies from where they roost, usually in cavities, singly. They fly out, and wherever they are, the memory probably connects right away to what is around that place. Not planning kind of where to go, but they're just there. And then as they go, because they cache everywhere, and we're talking about massive amount of caches. Again, those are pure speculations. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they do plan. But I think, again, thinking simplistically, it's like you wake up, you get out of your house, and here's a coffee shop right in the corner. Whether you remember where the other one is, you may just go there, and because it's easy, it's right there, right? So to me, it just may achieve the same goal much simpler. But, you know.
Okay, I think you misheard me because I think what you just said is consistent with what I interpreted you to be saying. That the bird is not thinking, right, what's going to be my sixth stop today?
Right.
Okay, so
yes,
I understand that. Can you think of a way to test for it? Now, maybe something you've just said leads in this direction, but one way that seems possible would be to make arrival at a successful cache contingent upon stopping at two others along the way.
It's possible because, again, we're talking about it's very difficult to test these things, and that's including other kind of species, right? Because, again, planning implies intent. And so when the bird goes in there, it's like, again, I'm feeling like the same way. Sometimes I feel certain things when I watch them, and it seems like they do have an intent because you can see they just take off and they just go straight to a particular location, and then they do something there, right? But I don't know how you could put a finger on it, right? So again, because the struggle is kind of thinking about what would be the simpler way to achieve the goal. Again, and the goal I do think for this bird is to survive, right? So they need to survive. They're small birds. They need to eat all the time. They eat all the time in the winter. They don't stop. They don't rest. They just eat throughout the winter, right? And so I don't know how to test it. Yeah, I think it's just for them. Yeah. I'm sure they can have their favorite trees or their favorite corner of the woods when they can go and they can cache more. They do need to weigh other challenges when they cache, which I've seen, right? So they definitely need to see are they being watched by other birds, where they're going. And that's very interesting. That's where we're going now, kind of trying to see, because we see this variation in caching propensity and memory. And now we're applying social network analysis because we have a lot of data on this. So we're trying to see if differences in cognitive ability that we detect is associated with non-random social network. In other words, one can predict that the bird that has better memory should try to get away from the other ones, right? But at the same time, one can expect that the bird that has bad memory should follow the bird with a good memory because it can lead it to where the food is and it can find it, right? So we'll have this kind of scavenger producer type of model. And I hope we'll get some answer to that by just following them and doing different manipulations, reorganizing the social interactions. But again, and they're very social. You know, they're stable. We see these birds stay in pairs throughout their life. Actually, interesting, we found no evidence for divorces for these birds. They stay in pairs. Only one partner dies, then they remate. But to test again whether they plan, we can interpret it, overinterpret, not. But it's the same kind of question, right? How far do we go based on evidence? Those are difficult issues, especially in the field.
Can I get one follow-up? This question concerns the captive versus wild birds. Did you take data on, or did you notice any difference in mortality or morbidity rates between the two?
Well,
any
there's no
behavioral-
mortality. There's no mortality in the
How
lab.
about
They live just
behavioral
fine.
differences, stereotypies or anomalies?
We've seen there's some fraction of individuals that will exhibit stereotypy. We usually don't use in an experiment, and we can see this right away. So we very small, usually would be about less than 10%. What's interesting, and it's kind of also interesting in that way, right? So I showed that hippocampus shrinks by about 30% in captivity. And so many of our experiments did not have death as endpoint. And I've successfully argued with our animal care committee, even though they always want us to kill animals, and I won that battle, so we're actually releasing them back. And we've had birds that spent 6 months in the lab that we've released back, and they survive. Most of them survive and reproduce just fine. Not only that, we've trapped birds from high and low elevation in our sites, and we release them at a third location because we in the spring when we release them, we don't have enough. We can't get there because of snow. These birds go precisely where we trapped them within days. So they know exactly where they came from, even though they spend most of their life in captivity. And it's so amazing. We bring these birds and these boxes from high and low in a truck. And I remember this one case, my students, when we opened these cages, and all the birds flew in one tree, maybe like 25 or 30 birds. And then they spend there for about 5 minutes, and then they separate into groups, and one group is like a beehive, just took off, and you can see them flying straight toward that mountain where we caught them, which is very impressive. But the fact is, we've published actually a paper on this. After captivity, their survival is no different from the birds that did not spend any time in captivity. But if we just keep them in captivity, they'll live. I mean, they will have a stressful. I mean, they do develop the stereotypy things, and the longer we keep them, the less happy they are. The less they resemble the real bird, right? It's just like me. If I spend too much time in the office, I'm not happy, and I'm becoming snappy. Then I go to the field, and then I'm happy.
So I think that's a good time to give you the
So my talk was explicitly on planning a few days ago, and there is no reference to intention or needing to know what the intent of an animal is to measure it. But so I'd love to chat more with you offline on that, and it actually gets to this point that it's a matter of sequencing, having contingencies and being able to sequence according to contingencies.
So you're saying that planning for future does not involve intent?
It can't. I would say that saying that you can only know it if you know the intent of the animal takes it out of the testable realm.
No, and I agree with this, but it will always.
There's behavioral tests that you can do.
Yeah, I agree with this.
And are being done with rats and other species now. And it's actually really interesting because it's essentially they're transposing paradigms that were used for humans into. In the one paper I'm thinking of in the rodent domain, but and there's no necessity to look at intent. It's a matter of can animals learn transition probabilities in essentially a Markov decision process, and that's very measurable. So I'd love to chat with you more offline about that. But I think possibly a more productive, although that could be applied to the spatial cognition question very readily. A possibly more productive line would be the pilfering stuff that you're doing now. So looking at another bird, recognizing it's looking at you, and then planning accordingly. And so I wanted to ask you if you had any more details about anti-pilfering techniques? Do they feign caching? What exactly do they do to resist pilfering?
Okay. Okay. So they do. The answer is yes. So they definitely could feign caches. We've seen it. Maybe not in response. What they also do, we've eliminated the distance. We've also looked at the groups. Right. We want to see, are they reciprocating with the mate or with the members of their own group versus different group, and they do not. Which also makes sense considering that caches are very individual. They actually will hide it from any chickadee, regardless of whether that chickadee is its mate that it spent a lot of time with, or a completely unknown chickadee, right? So in generally, when chickadee, especially in the lab, when they cache, they definitely do a lot of fake caching. When they stick it in there and they get it out, stick it and get it out. They definitely do that tactic. So we've kind of moved away a little bit from this because I agree with you. There's definitely a lot of progression, not only to see and criticism what we received. Okay, they recognize species, but do they recognize a bird? Do they know that that's the bird that stole my cache? But I'm a little skeptical on this because they all steal. They all are thieves. They are thieves. All of them, without exception. None of them will, have the honor not to steal it. And I wonder, and that kind of makes it different because it's a selfish game in a way within a social group.
Thank you.
One comparison before he goes.